This happened to me and my girlfriend Leah about 2 years ago. I've never really told this story to anyone except a close friend, because even now I still don't know how to make sense of it. We were on vacation in Europe. I'd rather not say where exactly, because the train line still runs there. That night, we had a long ride back to the city after visiting a small mountain town. It was late, maybe 10 p.m., and the train was one of those older regional ones with dim yellow lights, long narrow compartments, and that constant metallic clack of the wheels hitting the track. There were maybe 4 or 5 people in our carriage when we got on. We had 2 big backpacks and some snacks, and Leah was dozing off almost immediately once we sat. I remember that hum of the train, that constant dadum-dadum sound that feels almost hypnotic. I was just scrolling through my phone. There was no signal, so I opened my offline music and started playing something quietly. It felt peaceful, no one talking, just the rhythmic sound and the soft sway. But then, maybe 20 minutes in, I noticed something strange. The train made a brief stop at a small empty station. The lights outside were flickering, like the place hadn't been used much. Nobody got on, nobody got off, or at least I thought so. But as soon as we started moving again, I heard footsteps coming from the far end of the carriage. Slow, uneven steps, like someone dragging one foot slightly. I looked down the aisle. At first I thought I was imagining it, but there was a man walking toward us. Tall, thin, wearing a long brown coat. His head was slightly bowed, and he was holding what looked like a small leather satchel. Nothing too strange, except that when he passed under the flickering light near the door, his face didn't look right. It was like his skin didn't quite match his expression, like he was wearing exhaustion on top of something else. He walked past us without looking, stopped near the end of the carriage, and just stood there, facing the connecting door that led to the next car. I remember leaning toward Leah and whispering, "Did you see that guy?" She murmured a sleepy, "Mm-hmm," and went back to resting her head on my shoulder. A few minutes later, I glanced again. He hadn't moved, still facing that door. I started thinking maybe he was a conductor or waiting to switch cars at the next stop, but he wasn't wearing any kind of uniform. Then the lights flickered again, and when they came back on, he was gone. Just gone. I didn't hear the door slide open. There was no sound of it closing either. I even looked down the aisle, and the next door was still shut. I tried to tell myself maybe he crouched between the seats or moved silently, but my gut was tightening in that way it does when you know something's wrong. About 10 minutes later, I needed to use the restroom, which was at the far end of the same car. Leah was asleep, so I got up quietly. The carriage lights were dimmer now, just the emergency glow strips near the floor. As I walked, I kept glancing at the reflections in the windows. You know how at night the glass turns into a mirror. In one of them, I swear I saw movement behind me. Just a shadow, slightly taller than me, but when I turned, the aisle was empty. In the restroom, the lights were harshly white. I remember gripping the sink for a second just to calm myself, trying to laugh it off. The train jolted slightly, and I heard what sounded like footsteps right outside the door. When I stepped out, no one was there again. I went back to our seats, except I froze halfway down the aisle. Leah wasn't alone anymore. There was someone sitting in the seat directly across from her, facing her. A man. I only saw the back of his head at first. That same brown coat. He was leaning slightly toward her, as if watching her sleep. Every muscle in my body just locked. I whispered, "Hey!" No reaction. I took another step closer. He straightened up slowly, not startled, just aware. Then turned his head a bit, and I caught a glimpse of his profile. It was the same man from before, but his skin looked stretched, like someone had drawn his features too tight over the bones. I wanted to yell, but my throat went dry. I just said, "Sir, you okay?" He didn't move for a second, then slowly stood up. And as he did, the train went through a tunnel. Everything went black. When the lights came back, he wasn't there. The seat was empty. Leah stirred awake, confused, asking what happened. I didn't know what to say. We checked every compartment until the next station. Nothing. No sign of him anywhere. But when we sat back down, I noticed something I hadn't before. On the glass window next to Leah's seat, there was a faint handprint. Not like someone had touched it once. It looked pressed, fingers long, palm distorted, smeared slightly downward, like it had been dragging. The weirdest part, the handprint was on the outside of the glass, and we were already moving at full speed when that happened. We reached the city around midnight and got off without looking back. When the train pulled away, I watched it vanish down the tracks, each carriage flickering under the station lights. And in the last window, I swear I saw the outline of a man in a brown coat, just standing there, facing the direction we'd come from. It was my first time taking this particular train. I had gone into the city for a late work meeting and didn't finish until almost 10 p.m. I was exhausted and honestly just wanted to get home. The train was old, narrow compartments, wooden seats, flickering fluorescent lights, that kind of place where everything feels a little off at night. I boarded the train and found an empty compartment toward the middle. I set my briefcase down, slung my jacket over the seat, and sat by the window. The rhythmic clack of the wheels against the tracks was soothing, so I leaned back and let myself doze off for a few minutes. The day had drained me. When I woke, I noticed something strange. The compartment was completely empty. At first, I thought maybe everyone had just gotten off at the last station. I rubbed my eyes and tried to shake off the grogginess. The hum of the train was the only sound, and it felt oddly oppressive, like the carriage was too quiet. I reached over to check my briefcase, my fingers brushing against the papers inside, trying to convince myself everything was normal. After a few minutes, some passengers got on at the next stop. I hadn't noticed them enter. They were sitting silently across the aisle, and the first thing I realized was that they were staring at me. Just staring. I looked away, feeling my pulse quicken, trying to focus on my phone, but I didn't have any signal. Minutes passed, and the lights flickered. When they went dark for a brief moment, I felt like the whole carriage held its breath. When the lights came back on, the passengers had moved closer, still staring. I blinked, thinking maybe I had imagined it, but when I looked again, they were sitting only a few seats away, their eyes locked on me. I tried to stand up, to move to another seat, but something about the way they were watching made me freeze. I could smell faint perfume, smoke, and something metallic, like rust or old machinery, mixing in the air. My hands were shaking as I leaned against the wall, trying to steady myself. The lights flickered again, briefly plunging the carriage into darkness. This time, when the lights came back, they were almost right next to me, sitting silently, staring. My heart was pounding. I wanted to call out, to ask them why they were staring, but my voice caught in my throat. My throat felt tight, and I swallowed hard, trying to force calm. I looked out the window, hoping to ground myself in the passing scenery, but the glass reflected the carriage instead. Their reflections stared back at me. Shadows flickered unnaturally along the walls. I reached into my briefcase to grab my jacket, trying to act normal, but I could feel the cold sweat running down my back. Every time the lights flickered, I could feel them getting closer. It wasn't a normal movement. It was like the darkness itself carried them toward me. I tried to lean back in my seat, trying to make myself small, telling myself it was impossible, that I was exhausted and imagining it. But it didn't feel like imagination. By the time the train finally approached my station, I was shaking. I grabbed my briefcase and practically bolted from the compartment, not even looking back. When I turned, the carriage looked normal again. The passengers weren't there. Just empty seats and dim lights. I've taken other trains since, but I avoid this one whenever I can. Sometimes, when I think about that night, I can still feel their eyes, the flicker of the lights, the metallic scent, and the way the darkness seemed to carry them closer with each blink. I still don't know who or what they were. I've never told anyone because I don't think anyone would believe me. This happened to me and two of my friends, Emily and Jake, last year. We were on a late-night train, heading back from a weekend trip. It was one of those older trains with narrow compartments, wooden seats, and flickering lights that made everything feel just slightly off. We got into our compartment around 11 p.m. The train was almost empty, maybe 2 or 3 other passengers, all quietly dozing. We dropped our backpacks, joked a little about how creepy the train looked, and Emily made herself comfortable by the window while Jake and I leaned back. I remember listening to the rhythmic clack of the wheels against the tracks. It was hypnotic at first, almost calming, but there was something in the quiet that felt heavy. About half an hour into the ride, Jake said he was going to stretch his legs and check out the next carriage. Emily and I stayed behind, chatting softly. I was thinking about how relaxing the ride was, watching the faint reflections of the passing lights in the window, while Emily was scrolling on her phone, occasionally glancing up at the dark tunnel outside. Then the lights flickered violently, and for a moment, everything went dark. My heart skipped a beat, and Emily let out a small nervous laugh. I tried to tell myself it was just the old train wiring, but even as I leaned back, I felt this icy tension crawl down my spine. When the lights came back on, something caught my eye at the far end of the carriage. A man was standing there, tall, wearing a long dark coat. His scarf was pulled high, covering most of his face, leaving only his eyes visible. The thing about his eyes was, they weren't moving. They were fixed on us, unblinking. I whispered to Emily, "Do you see him?" She nodded, but her face had gone pale. She was gripping her phone so tightly that the knuckles turned white. My mind was racing. I kept thinking, maybe he's just another passenger. Maybe he's waiting for something. Maybe he's dangerous. He started walking toward our compartment slowly, and I noticed something weird about the way he moved. He didn't really step. It was more like gliding, silent and smooth. Emily grabbed my arm, and I could feel her trembling. I wanted to call out to him, to ask if he needed something, but my throat went dry. Then, the lights flickered again and went out completely. I froze. The darkness pressed against me like a weight. I could hear Emily's shallow breathing next to me, and faintly, I thought I heard the scraping of nails along metal. My mind jumped to every horror story I'd ever read. "It's nothing. It's nothing," I kept repeating, but I couldn't convince myself. When the lights came back on, the man was gone. I checked the aisle through the small gap in the door, but the carriage looked empty. Nothing made sense. My heart was racing, and I could feel my hands shaking as I adjusted the strap on my backpack, checking the compartment for anything I might need to defend myself. Emily was hugging her knees, staring out the window, whispering under her breath. Jake didn't return. Minutes passed. Every little creak of the train, every rattle of the overhead luggage made my stomach twist. I got up to check the aisle quietly, careful not to make a sound. The lights were dim, flickering in a way that made shadows dance across the seats. I leaned against the wall, trying to peer down the aisle, and I swear I saw a shadow shift across the far end. I tried calling Jake softly, "Hey man, you okay?" But my voice sounded tiny, swallowed by the hum of the train. Emily shook her head and whispered, "Don't do that. Don't call him." The air smelled strange, metallic, like old machinery, with a faint hint of something decaying. Every time I glanced at the windows, the reflections were wrong, faces flickering in the glass that weren't ours. I caught movement behind me in a reflection and spun around, but nothing was there. Hours seemed to pass in a blur. The man never appeared again, but the noises continued. Soft, dragging sounds along the ceiling, faint whispering that I couldn't place, and occasional tapping on the window, slow and deliberate, like fingernails. Emily and I huddled together on the seats, clutching our bags, leaning against each other, trying to stay awake, trying to convince ourselves we weren't imagining it. Finally, the train slowed for a station at first light. We rushed out as quickly as we could. Jake finally appeared, looking pale and shaken. He said he had wandered toward the dining car, but couldn't find his way back. Everything seemed different, like the train had changed while he was gone. We never found out who the man was, or what the noises meant. I don't know if he ever existed, or if it was something else entirely. Even now, when I think about that night, I can feel the sense of being watched, the flickering shadows, the reflections in the glass, and the sound of fingernails tapping on the window. I haven't been on a night train since,